let us conclude by bringing into perspective and focus what we have seen so far. At its heart, independence is a very simple, elementary and intuitive concept. Independence captures the idea that independent possibilities, commonly interpreted, will multiply. Independence is a product rule at heart. Where matters get complex is when we have a large number of putatively independent events. In such settings, to check independence requires a formal check of a very large number of product possibilities. This looks forbidding. But again, common experience and intuition shows us the way. The simplest setting where independence arises in large complex experiments is when one has a compound experiment comprised of repeated independent trials. So in particular, in the notation we've seen, suppose Gothic A1 represents a first trial whose outcomes are a finite or a countable number of possibilities. Gothic A2 represents a second trial whose outcomes are possibly different and again a finite or countable number of possibilities, and so forth. When we think of the compound experiment comprised of all these trials put together one after the other, then the sample points are, let's say, n tuples of possibilities, and we call this compound experiment the product space. The elements are obtained by Cartesian products of the individual trials. The natural probability measure in such a setting is the product measure, where we take the individual atomic measures for each of the trials and simply multiplies them out. As we've seen, this immediately, without the necessity for further checks, gives us independence on a large scale. As a slogan, events determined by non-overlapping groups of independent trials are also independent, and no further checks are necessary. This concludes part 2 of Tableau 9. When we return, we shall move on to looking at how independence arises in subtle and deep ways in a variety of problems of practical import. So, in the next Tableau, we'll talk about games of chance, and in particular gambling. We'll talk about genetics, and we'll talk about sociology and a return to basketball and the hot hand.